Welcome to this telescope review by the Saint John Astronomy Club in Saint John, New Brunswick, Canada. Recently, the president of the club donated a Celestron StarSense Explorer LT, which is a new manual go-to telescope, to the club for outreach purposes. Club does a lot of outreach, and we take personal telescopes with us as well as some club scopes so that the public can enjoy looking at views of the night sky. So with this new scope, we'd never seen this kind of technology before, and so I thought it would be appropriate to do a review of this new telescope from Celestron. So it comes packaged in a fairly small box, very lightweight, and the box makes a lot of claims on the cover. So let's look at those claims and see what kind of telescope this is, and is it easy to use, is it good quality. So Celestron claims it's a 114 millimeter alt-az Newtonian reflector. It says no experience required. Finding objects couldn't be easier. Precisely locate Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, and more, even from the city. Or take your telescope to even darker skies and marvel at nebulae and galaxies. Proprietary StarSense Explorer technology. Don't know what that is, or at least I didn't until I tried out the scope, so we'll learn all about that. They say dock, launch, observe. So sounds easy. Let's see if it is. So what comes in the box? There is a Newtonian telescope. It has a 500 millimeter tube and a 114 millimeter, or 4.5 inch for you non-Canadians, aperture, and an adjustable mirror. The mount is all aluminum. It has a red dot finder. Comes with 25 millimeter and 10 millimeter eyepieces, a 2x Barlow to give you effectively a 12.5 and 5 millimeter eyepieces, a smartphone mount, and a gadget bag. I really like the gadget bag, by the way, and I'm thinking about getting one for my regular scope. So here's what the scope looks like assembled. I do have some experience with telescopes, so it didn't take me long to figure out how to put it together. The instructions were fairly clear, so I think that even someone who's not used a telescope before could figure out fairly easily how to get this thing together. So it's very lightweight, which is both a positive and a negative. Being lightweight, it's easy to move around, but being lightweight, it's easy to bump and can be moved in the wind, even with a light breeze. Unfortunately, everything seems to be plastic and lightweight aluminum, making, so that keeps the cost down, keeps the weight down, but also means that the scope is less durable. It has slow motion controls for the alt direction, which you can see by that little handle underneath the or between the two orange knobs. But the azimuth control is strictly by pushing the telescope. So you don't have fine left-right movement, but you do have fine up and down. Here's a closer view of the slow motion altitude controller. It's just like a screwdriver handle almost. You lock the nut on the left, the orange nut, and then slowly turn the screwdriver handle, and it has a screw that very slowly raises the telescope. This view shows the bottom of the scope with the collimation screws to allow you to adjust the mirror and get it into perfect alignment. Out of the box, it was actually fairly well aligned. It didn't need collimation. So if you don't have a collimator, hopefully when you open it like this one, you'll be able to use it right away. But with this type of scope, we always recommend you get a collimator, or at least join an astronomy club that has a collimator. So this is the secret sauce of this scope. This is what's new what they mean by new technology. On the left picture there, you see a kind of a bug-like mount, and that's where you put your smartphone. And it's adjustable for most size smartphones. This is an older Apple iPhone that I mounted in there, but there's room for a bigger phone as well. And here's how it works. So you can see on the right-hand picture, my smartphone camera is mounted over a mirror. So underneath that bug carapace, when you remove that for viewing purposes, there's a mirror that's precisely aligned with the sky. So you put your camera over that, you center it, and then there's proprietary software that you install on your smartphone. Comes with Android and Apple software, and the software looks at the sky using the camera through that mirror and figures out where it is and what it's looking at. The app actually uses GPS to also know the position and orientation of the smartphone, and therefore the scope. So it's pretty precise, very impressive. The app as well, very simple to use. The instruction manual tells you how to set everything up, and definitely recommend doing this during the day. So you follow the instructions for how to align the red dot finder, because you need that at least for your first alignment with the sky, and then once that's done, the telescope app guides you the rest of the way. So go out at night with a clear view of the sky. Find a location that's not doesn't have buildings or trees or anything overhanging, so you've got a nice clear view of the sky. Put in your 25mm eyepiece. Point the scope to an open area of the sky where you can see stars. Use the red dot finder to align on a bright star or planet. And so this here at this point, you would have to have understood how red dot finders work. So there are videos online that tell you how to set up and use a red dot finder, and the instructions that come with the scope are fairly clear. But if you've never done it before, would definitely recommend watching videos on how it's done. So once you've got the scope aligned using the red dot finder and the eyepiece, you launch the app and then follow the alignment instructions. I ended up having to tweak the position of the smartphone once I had to land on a bright object. I used Mars, but any bright star will do. So you drag the screen around and align the crosshairs with the image with what you saw with the red dot finder, and that's how it figures out what you're pointing at and where you are. So from here, the software takes over for automatic positioning, and if you've forgotten your instructions or you don't want to go through the instruction manual, you have plenty of reminders on the screen for how to set it up, how to locate objects. And if you move the scope at this point, which of course being so lightweight is fairly easy to do, especially if you have children around, you may have to begin the alignment process over again. So once you've gone through the alignment process, you can confirm it. And once the scope knows what you're pointing at and where you are in the world, which it does automatically, you're good to go. So as I say, I use Mars as my setup target. You can see there in the screenshot of the app that there's a green box around Mars. So it's identified the bright red object that I was pointing at, which I knew was Mars, but you might not have known, as Mars. It knew it was Mars even before, just by its own database analysis and analyzing the camera image. It already knew it was pointing at Mars. And underneath you can see there's a little brown box that says Mars. If you click on that, it brings up a whole information sheet about Mars that even includes a audio tour. So how do you find another object? Well, I decided I would use Betelgeuse. So I went from Mars to Betelgeuse, and then I thought, well, can I get back to Mars? So in this screenshot, I'm on Betelgeuse, and I've told it I want to go to Mars. I used the little magnifying glass tool at the bottom right there, and typed in my search target as Mars. And I'll show you a little more about the search navigation in a minute. So from Betelgeuse, when I selected Mars, those yellow chevrons appeared. So it still knows exactly where it is and what it's looking at, and you can see it's highlighting other objects, bright objects that it knows are currently visible in the direction that the scope is pointing. So maybe I would want to investigate those. So the highlighting is there to help me navigate if I don't know what I'm looking for. The yellow chevrons are pointing towards Mars, and so what that is telling me is this is the direction I need to move the scope. So I need to slew it to the right and up to get to Mars. And so not using the red dot finder, not using the eyepiece, just looking at the app, I move the scope manually until those chevrons lined up with Mars, and I'll show you in the next picture. Then I decided I'd try to find something I couldn't see, and the sky was still fairly bright, so I knew the Pleiades were up, but I didn't know exactly where they were. So from Betelgeuse again, I did a search for the Pleiades, and the chevrons appeared, pointing in the direction I had to move the telescope. So as I say, it was still fairly bright. The sun was still setting at the time I shot the video, and so Pleiades were not yet naked eye. When so I followed the chevrons, I moved the scope until the Pleiades were centered, and then when I looked through the eyepiece, even though I couldn't see them naked eye, there they were. So the StarSense app doesn't need a lot of information to figure out where it is and how to point. There were just a few bright stars visible and Mars at the time. Recovering from a bump, I decided I would, while pointing at the Pleiades, I bumped the scope a little bit, and the app knew immediately that the scope had moved, and it immediately tried to figure out where it was again. So it analyzed the sky image and figured out where I was pointing, which of course was still at the Pleiades, or close to it. And then I could just continue viewing. So I didn't have to go through a whole realignment of the scope after bumping it. So let's take a little look at the app that comes with this. There's a browse feature that allows you to browse for bright objects. You can search for objects that you know by name, or you can let the app suggest interesting targets depending on where you are. You can click on a target and it will show you how to move the scope to find it. You can see in the list of brightest stars, so I chose the brightest stars. I tapped the brightest stars menu and these came up, and it tells me list of brightest stars and their magnitude, and then the rise and set times. So if I'm interested in looking at Arcturus, I can see what time it's going to rise, and here it was not going to be rising until 11:52. So I was viewing at just after 6 p.m. So I would have a few hours to wait before I could observe Arcturus. You can also browse through the planets. So you click on the planets and moons object menu item, and then it gives you the list of the planets, their brightness, and their rise and set times. If you click on an object in this view, you get a object info screen, and this is the same object info screen that comes up if you tap it while using the application. And for some objects, there's pretty extensive audio commentary. I was really impressed with how much information it had. In this case on Uranus, also listened to the one on Mars and some of the stellar objects. I was impressed to actually be able to fulfill a life goal of mine, which was to find Uranus in a small telescope. So I've seen it in other people's giant go-to telescopes, and that's really impressive, but I typically just use small telescopes, and so I was interested in trying to see Uranus through a smaller scope. And the sky was not yet dark enough for me to find Uranus by eye, so I told the scope I wanted to target Uranus, and it was near Mars. So I was on Mars at the time and got the chevrons pointing to where Uranus was. I moved the telescope so that Uranus was aligned, as you can see in the green box. I could not see Uranus naked eye, but when I looked, like trying to use the red dot finder to find it, I couldn't do it. The sky was not dark enough. But StarSense took me right there, and looking through the eyepiece, I could see this greeny, bluish star, which is diagnostic of Uranus. And then listened to a very interesting lecture about Uranus. And so if you buy the StarSense telescope or even download the app, I strongly recommend going through the lectures on the planets. By the way, the app is free. Anyone can download it. You do not have to have a StarSense telescope to use the app. If you want to just get the planetary information or do a little bit of sky navigation with your phone, you can do it all without a telescope. So, what are the different browse options? Tonight's best objects, moons and planets, brightest stars, best double stars, Messier objects, Caldwell objects, constellations, and asterisms. So these are the lists of common objects that people will want to view. You can also search for specific objects using the search function. So if the object you're looking for is, you already know the name, you don't need to go through this browsing feature. I thought I would search for an object that was below the horizon to see what it would do. And so I chose Sirius, which I knew had not yet risen, and I was viewing the Hyades at the time. And so it pointed the scope below the horizon. It didn't give me any warnings that the object was below the horizon, which I thought was interesting. But something I thought was really cool about this is, I like to watch planets as they rise, and it's often hard to align the scope exactly where the planet's going to come up if you're doing it all manually. But with this feature, I can track the planet as it's rising, and it'll be centered in the screen as the planet comes up. And this is all done manually, with no motors, no batteries to worry about or power supply. Okay, so let's just, in summary, have a look at the pros and cons of this scope. So pros, it's very lightweight, which makes it easy to move around and set up. It comes with two eyepieces, 25mm and 10mm, and a 2-time Barlow, which gives you a lot of viewing flexibility. 114mm is big enough for most beginners and for moon and planet enthusiasts. The proprietary StarSense software is available for free for both iPhone and Android. And I've got to say, if nothing else, get this app. It's very impressive. Even if you don't get a StarSense telescope, it's a very useful tool to have on your phone. Comes with the red dot finder. It can be used with or without the smartphone. So if your battery dies on the smartphone, or if you just want to navigate the sky without using the StarSense technology, you can certainly do that. I like the slow motion control for the altitude. It's pretty good for short duration movement, but the missing azimuth slow motion control, well, we'll talk about that in cons, I guess. But the altitude control, very nice. It has decent documentation and lots of online tutorials. So if you get lost, there's lots of videos to check out to get you back on track. And the price is pretty reasonable, a little less than 250 Canadian dollars. So that's close to 200 American, I guess. And that's a pretty good price point for somebody starting out. And you don't have to, you're not spending money on motor drives and so on. You're going to do all the navigation by hand. The software, the little app, is the secret sauce for this telescope. Basically, it takes a department store telescope and turns it into an intelligent piece of hardware. So the cons. Well, it's very lightweight. I know that was a pro, but it's also a con. So it's not steady in the wind or when moving the tube. The eyepieces were pretty low quality, and the Barlow was low quality. So I found the image quality not that great, but if you buy the scope, you use the scope for a while, and you're enjoying it, enjoying astronomy, you can invest in better eyepieces. There was no slow motion control for azimuth, so I had to move it by hand. So there was a lot of shaking, hard to get nice, slow, even movement. So if you want to track an object, that can be a little frustrating. I also would call this a warm weather telescope. The low quality plastic parts will break easily, especially in cold weather. So we've had experience with other loaner scopes with the club where they come back from being used by one of our members, and the plastic parts have all broken because they've taken it out in the winter. Plastic's cold, they've over tightened it, they've jostled it or whatever and broken the plastic, and that's certainly a good possibility with this scope too. Also, the app is very power intensive, so that limits the battery time, especially in cold weather. I was out at -2°C with an older cell phone, and the battery had run down in about 20 minutes. And to remedy that, I probably could have turned the light on the phone down considerably, and certainly under darker skies, I would have done that. And having a backup battery or one of those clamp-on batteries would probably extend the life of the phone. But in warmer weather, like let's say it had been 5 or 10 degrees, it definitely would have lasted an hour. So that's not too bad. The documentation and the box suggest that you really don't have to have technical knowledge to use the scope, but I would say you do have to have some competence in using software, and you must be capable of aligning, moving, and pointing the telescope, and that does take practice for beginners and is often a point of frustration. But the app does try and help in that it guides you. So let's take a look again at those claims that were on the box. So they say a 414 millimeter alt-az Newtonian reflector. That's true. This is a great size starter scope. I wish I'd started out with a scope like this as opposed to the one I did start with. They say no experience required. Finding objects couldn't be easier. I would say that's not entirely true. I think you need to have some experience with using a telescope, reading documentation, going through the videos. You'll need those things to get out there and set up and use this scope. Precisely locate Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, and more, even from the city. I was in the city. It was on my driveway, fairly bright evening. Sun had not set. Streetlights were on, but I had no trouble finding Mars and other bright objects. And as I mentioned earlier, I also found dimmer objects that I couldn't see, but the scope knew where they were. And I used only the instructions from the app to find them, so that's pretty impressive. Take your scope to even darker skies and marvel at nebulae and galaxies. Sure. So I did view Orion Nebula, I viewed Andromeda, and they weren't great views. So yes, the sky was still a bit light, but the low quality optics don't really bring out the details of these fainter objects. Proprietary StarSense Explorer technology. Well, that's true. I've not seen another mirror-based star finding technology on the market. I'm sure there will be more with the success of this telescope technology. The mirror and the app are pretty incredible. I was really impressed. Their final claim, dock, launch, observe. That's probably true if you've been using it for a while, but and if you've got experience with telescopes. But if this is your first scope, you've never used one before, I would say dock, launch, observe would be not possible right away. So I think someone would have to spend time with the documentation, figure out how to align the red dot finder, figure out how to focus a telescope, figure out how to competently move it around, fiddle with how to dock the phone properly. You don't just drop the phone in and it's all aligned. There is some fiddling involved. And then learn how to use it. Figure out which magnification to use. Figure out how to keep an object centered while changing the eyepiece or adding the bar light. So these are all things that I think are going to come with experience. But overall, it is fairly easy to use, but don't expect the scope to do everything for you. You will have to learn how to use the technology. So overall, I think this is a great little starter scope. I'm very impressed with the app particularly. I'm not so impressed with the quality of the scope. For maybe for $400 they could have made it a more robust scope, but I would definitely recommend this over those long tube refractors that you see at department stores and big box stores around Christmas time. For $100, those are junk. You'll throw them out. You'll never use them. They're too hard to use. But this is definitely a scope worth investing in. So thank you.